Hi, everyone. I am Don Yeager, and welcome to the Corporate Competitor Podcast. 2 years ago, I began a journey to sit with some of the brightest executives in the world to discuss how participation in sports shaped their professional trajectory. After more than 100 conversations with executives from companies like Amazon, Netflix, Disney, and Google, I have learned that sports not only taught these leaders great lessons that translate to business, but it is a common denominator among their leadership trait. Some of the guests' athletic experiences earned them a place in their Sports Hall of Fame, like Chick-fil-A chairman Dan Cathy. Some hung up their cleats after high school, like Delta Airlines CEO Ed Bastian, while others, like Condoleezza Rice, claimed they were terrible in their sport. But no matter their skill level, they have all told me that being a part of a team taught them leadership lessons they still use today. One of the highlights of this year was when my team merged into Maxwell Leadership, and I gained an incredible teammate in Chris Goede, who serves as Maxwell's executive vice president. For our last episode of 2023, I invited Chris to our reflection episode to talk about his favorite corporate competitor guests, and specifically the formulas shared in the episodes recorded with those guests. All of these formulas we talk about today will be in our bonus resource that you can download on Corporate Competitor Podcast /127.
We keep things very simple here at Maxwell Leadership. John really defines leadership as influence. You don't have to have a title. Doesn't matter your tenure, none of that. Leaders, we are in the behavioral change business. The common language of leadership is influence. It's the 5 levels. Here is the formula that will help shape and enhance your culture inside your organization.
Chris, thanks so much for joining us.
Don, it is an honor to be here. I'm a huge sports fan. You know my background, my family. So I'm an avid listener to your podcast all the time. I absolutely am grateful for our friendship, but even more importantly, what you and John Maxwell have done over the last 12 to 18 months as we have brought your organization and your leadership alongside John and Mark Cole. And man, you guys have big dreams and big plans of impacting people around the world. We're so grateful because the niche that you fill for us, we need it. With you focusing on so much of great teams and what it's like to be a great teammate. Matter of fact, you were just with our team a couple of days ago and talked about how do we become a great teammate. And I've heard rave reviews from people. They were enlightened from your conversation. So grateful for you, your friendship, your organization and leadership. And man, I am excited not only for this session on the podcast, but what you and John Maxwell are thinking about in the future for impacting people.
Let me explain real quick how we came to the idea of the podcast you and I are going to record. A few months ago, one of our guests actually gave a formula of exactly how they thought. It was a mathematical formula. And I was so taken by it that I went over and I immediately called Savannah, our producer extraordinaire, and I said, think about all the formulas that have been offered us by the incredible people we've had the good fortune to have on this podcast. Savannah took it next level, went to work with the interns and actually started breaking down previous episodes, looking for formulas where there was an action opportunity for us, the listener, to take what was offered and go do something immediately. Now, Chris, you've spent a career alongside the greatest thought leader in the world, John Maxwell. And if there's anything John is famous for, it is breaking down the complex to simple formulas. That's why I also knew you'd be the best teammate to share this session with. I want to start with a formula offered by a guest that you said was among your favorites.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about John and his formulas. And you just gave away to our listeners around the world the secret of why I've been here on and off for about 24 years. And that's the word simple. It's in his DNA and it's part of our organization. So we always look for simple formulas. And one of the episodes that you did was with Laura Gentili, Senior Vice President of ESPN Marketing Division. Forbes even named her the most powerful woman in US sports. And she talked about a great team. She said, hey, you have to assemble a team that truly supports each other, that buys into the goal of how their team impacts the organization or the outcome. And you've got to have respect for each other. How do you go about doing this, Laura? What does that look like? And she immediately said, hey, you got to assemble the right team. You got to develop them. You got to cultivate them. So that little simple formula, how do we support, how do we buy in, and how do we respect each other, was a great nugget for me in thinking about how I lead my team.
Chris, you made a slight reference to your athletic history. You actually were a lineman at Liberty University, played for a former NFL football coach when you were there. And
Yeah.
now, fast forward, you get to be the father of a son who is a tight end on the University of Georgia team, headed to the college football playoffs with an opportunity to win a second national championship. As you think about that formula, assemble a team that supports each other, they all have to buy into the same goal. The one piece of it that I remember listening and thinking, boy, that's the hardest part, is getting them to buy into that same goal. How have you made that happen?
The huddle.
Okay.
Don, you and I both were not the most athletic athletes, but we played such a pivotal role. We had to understand that we had to buy into doing our job. We have so many different skills and so many different talents, but we've got to get them to buy in first to why they're on the team and that skill set. Secondly, is how do they understand that they're buying into what they are doing for the team and how that plays into the bigger part of the organization. You've got to get the individuals to buy into what their responsibilities are. What are their KPIs on a daily basis in order for the team to be successful? Individual responsibility with collective pride.
Individual responsibility with collective pride. That's really strong. Speaking of pride, I do have to tell you, Savannah and her team love to do a little research on our guests. And when they came back with your high school photo with that mullet behind you.
You don't know this story. Let me just share this. So my son, all of a sudden, he's in this mode where he wants to have a flow coming out of the back of his helmet with his hair.
Oh.
His mom and I are like, what is going on? Matter of fact, at a game recently, when he took his helmet off, a buddy of ours said he needs to get a haircut. That's beside the point. Next day at work, I come in and Savannah and y'all's team sends me that picture.
Goede mullet, baby.
Goede mullet. Oh, I saw it. Took a screenshot of it and I sent it to my internal family text. Well, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. Check out this flow. I felt a little bit of pride after I saw that picture with my son trying to get the flow out of his helmet.
If he doesn't cut it after seeing this picture, which we're going to post in the show notes.
Got it.
So let me share a formula that really caught my attention. It came from a guest we had named Brandon Steiner, the guy that sold the old Yankee Stadium.
Wow.
Tore the place down and sold it all off. Grain by grain of dirt and seat by seat and locker by locker. He built the largest sports marketing and memorabilia company in the country, Steiner Sports. And he said consistency over time equals credibility. It doesn't matter what my degree is or what else I might have achieved. If I can show up consistently every day and my team knows what to expect from me, it immediately gives me credibility, maybe even credibility that on other levels I wouldn't deserve. I thought about Derek Jeter, the subject of a really fantastic ESPN series this last year, The Captain. Jeter really hit his prime during the steroid home run era, when the biggest thing you could do in the planet was smash 400-foot home runs and trot around the bases backwards, much of it fueled by artificial means. And yet Derek Jeter became known as one of the greatest Yankees of all time, the captain, so revered by his teammates, not for hitting home runs. He just slapped singles all day long.
Yeah.
And then he figured out how to steal second. Next thing you know, he's in scoring position. When Derek Jeter was in the game, you knew what you were going to get. That idea of how you create consistency over time and what that gives you in the way of credibility.
I absolutely love that. One of the biggest competencies that's missing in leadership today goes right back to this formula that we're talking about right here. leaders need to understand the power of consistency. And in this lesson, we talked about it as credibility. You may have heard John Maxwell say that consistency over time compounds. That's the same thing tied to the credibility here. Your credibility will compound over time if you're consistent. Too many leaders and organizations at all levels on a daily basis, their team does not know. They don't know what to expect or who to expect is going to show up in their leader. One of the organizations that we work with, one of the most influential individuals at the C-suite happens to be one of the administrators in one of the vice president's office. She has two different color coffee mugs. I'm not going to say that they're red and green because they're not. However, they represent red and green. Depending on that day, that administrator will place her coffee cup out front, and the team will know whether it's a good day to come in or it's not. Now, if that's the most influential person inside that Fortune 500 organization, can you imagine how much our influence could increase with this formula that you're talking about here? If, as leaders, we become consistent over time, our credibility will continue to grow.
Wow. In your role at Maxwell Leadership, you run corporate solutions. You help large companies putting teammates of yours in those companies to help their leaders grow. And I know one of the companies you do a lot of work for is a company we're big fans of, Hendrick Automotive, with Rick Hendrick, who was a guest on this podcast. And consistency over time would ascribe to Mr. H.
Absolutely. When you think about consistency building credibility, he is an image that comes to my mind. I oftentimes have been taught from my mentors, my coaches, to make sure as a leader that I am responding, not reacting. In order to do that, in between there has to be a deep breath at times. When you react, it's out of an ego, it's out of pride. When you respond, it's out of your true character. That is a challenge that all of us as leaders have. Even as great as Mr. H is, to your point, when you depart from that, it spreads throughout the organization in a hurry because people desire and I think crave consistency.
I love it. Chris, another formula that resonated with you that you shared was offered up by one of my favorite people in the entire planet, Kim McHugh from Chevron. Kim is the highest ranking woman in the oil drilling industry and a longtime friend. She's just incredible.
Yeah, this formula is really one of our core values, growth. When I listened to that episode, I was intrigued by the recruiting story. I'm a fan of volleyball. I love the sport. My daughter plays Division I. The entire podcast with her, you can hear her referring back to lessons that she learned and has applied now on her daily basis as a leader, to your point, as she leads at the highest level for Chevron. Okay, so how do I do this? What does this look like? And you guys talked a little bit about we're going to be lifelong learners as leaders, and that's the formula. Leaders equal learners. You have to accept coaching. You got to ask for it. You got to accept it. And you have to be okay with feedback. And you have to ask for it, and you got to take it continuously. Matter of fact, I know inside your organization, you mentioned on there in your team that you guys have a little phrase.
Feedback is the breakfast of champions.
I love it.
Forget Wheaties.
Yeah. So I wrote that one
probably
down
just
too.
lost Wheaties as a potential sponsor, but that's cool.
I like that. The other thing I want to say about that episode, and I want to encourage those that are listening to go back and listen to that one, is you guys talk about a form of learning being in how do we ask questions. We need to be curious as leaders, not only in competency, but it's in your people. The learning never stops. You know this, you're a lifelong learner. Those that we work with are lifelong learners, and it is a simple formula, but very profound.
It's pretty powerful. So let me offer one more formula that really stood out to me, and it's from a more recent guest, co-founder of Ritz-Carlton, Horst Schulze. You've done a lot of podcasts, Chris. Yours is incredible. We've done 2 years worth, and we've always had standalone episodes. This guy is so good.
Yeah.
We couldn't figure out what to cut.
Wow.
So we just made 2 episodes out of Horst Schulze. He's that good.
He is.
Ritz-Carlton is internationally renowned for its customer service. They are so good at making you as the guest feel, ladies and gentlemen, serving ladies and gentlemen, you feel like you're a gentleman, and they are not servants. They are ladies and gentlemen. 84 years old, Horst Schulze talked about a four-part formula. When a customer had an issue, something that maybe hadn't gone right, it did not matter your role within the organization. Anybody within the organization took the complaint. And the first role was to listen. The second was to show empathy. Third, apologize, even if the problem is not yours. And then finally, correct.
Yeah.
And go to work on correcting it. What can I do to solve this problem for you? A waiter at one of the Ritz restaurants might have asked a guest, "How was your evening last night?" Listen to what the guest has to say. It was a great evening, but our TV didn't work in our room. Boom. Show empathy. My gosh, that is not the standard we want to live to here at Ritz-Carlton. We don't do that. Apologize. You know what? I'm so sorry about that. It's not the waiter's fault the TV didn't work. But then they give every employee $2,000 as a budget to solve the problem. No one's ever used the $2,000,
Right.
but the employees feel empowered because they have $2,000. So the waiter says, "Can I buy you breakfast?" What does the guest feel?
Yeah.
Gosh, somebody cared that my TV
Yeah.
wasn't working, as opposed to most hotels that we've stayed in that no one seems to care. You are really great with your teams. You have an amazing portion of the organization, what you all do within corporate training, corporate development, leadership development. How do you teach them to be better listeners and maybe a little more empathetic?
Man, what a simple formula. Listen, show empathy, apologize, and correct. As leaders, we strive for this customer service index, the CSI. Leadership is a visual sport. Our people are watching us all the time. Perry Holly, who does a podcast with me, says it all the time, and it's so true. As an organization, we're looking at our CSI, our customer service index, and trying to increase that. It starts with the leader and his team. What is your ESI? What is your employee service index? Because as leaders treat their people, your people will then treat the customer. I guarantee you with Horst, which he and John have been friends for a long time, he has this down to a science and lives it out. His people in turn live it out to their guests. You have to model that behavior. I try to with my team. In turn, I want them to then model it to their team or to the customer, the end user, whoever it may be. So if leadership truly is a visual sport, we need to be very aware of what's happening. If we're not happy with what our customer service index is, then we might want to look in the mirror of how we're treating our team.
Chris Goede, I'm going to end up with a formula out of this one. Leadership equals visual sport. I'm going to have a formula just because I got you today. One of the things about the Horst Schulze conversation that really, really stood out is how systematized they are. We think of all this as, oh, it just felt so natural. Boy, they work the systems. They know exactly how long you stand in line at the front desk and at what stage you're going to get impatient. When they know that you're going to be in line longer than that stage, they send somebody out with a warm cookie to make sure that you're distracted. And in some ways, the clock starts anew because you now have a cookie. It's genius.
Yeah.
I'm part of the National Speakers Association.
Yeah.
And there's a particular group there of speakers that we get together once a year. And most recently in Nashville at their conference, they had one of our presenters talked about the idea that in his organization, anything you do more than 3 times should become a process. Offboarding or onboarding.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
anything within your organization that's done more than 3 times, develop a process for it. Sounds crazy because I can't imagine have that many processes in our
Right.
organization. But the truth is, where do most frustrations occur? It's when someone just didn't quite do it the way we all know it should be done. Anything done more than 3 times should become a process.
Love that.
Chris, the last formula actually comes from John Maxwell, someone that we have had as a guest on the podcast. Tell me how a John Maxwell formula helped you.
As we mentioned early on, we keep things very simple here at Maxwell Leadership. And John wrote a book several years ago now, The 5 Levels of Leadership. John really defines leadership as influence. You don't have to have a title, doesn't matter your tenure, none of that. It's all about influence. One of our executive facilitators also helps us with content, Greg Cagle. He defines culture as how do we think, act, and interact? What does that look like on a daily basis? And that in turn will lead to your culture. Here is the formula that will help shape and enhance your culture inside your organization. Common language leads to a common belief that leads to common behaviors. Leaders, we are in the behavioral change business, first internally, and then second with those that we've been blessed to have influence with. The common language of leadership is influence. It's the 5 levels. Oftentimes, Don, and you would know this as you have coached executives, if you spoke to organizations, if you sat down with their lead team and you said, how do we define leadership here? If there were 10 people in the room, you'd probably get 12 different answers. We're not all speaking the same language. That cascades down throughout the organization. And as you know, as an athlete growing up, the self-talk that happens, think about a pitcher, right? He's got to go inside. If the pitcher's going, don't hit him, don't hit him, don't hit him,
They're going to hit him.
they're going to hit him versus get on the inside, get on the inside.
It's like my golf swing with the lake in front of me.
That's exactly right.
Don't put it in the water. Don't put it in the water. Why not just walk over there and throw it in the water?
That's right. So it starts with self, always starts with self. Once we begin speaking that, and anything in our life that we have that repetitive self-talk, we begin to believe it. So as our team is hearing this common language of leadership, they begin to believe these 5 levels of influence, and it becomes a common behavior. Mr. Hendrick, we've been working with their organization for 7-8 years. Absolutely love the partnership with them. He's a servant leader. He invests in his team and his people. But he came to me and we began having conversations about culture. As you know, they have dealerships all over the country.
Oh, yeah.
And his thing to me was, Chris, one of the things that keeps me up at night is that I feel like there is different cultures in stores that maybe are on the East Coast versus the Midwest or the West Coast. And if I go visit a store out in California, I feel like we have a different definition of leadership. We believe differently. We behave differently. Now, 7-8 years later, we can go into a dealership, whether it's in the East Coast, the Midwest, or in the West Coast, talk about leadership as influence, and immediately people will begin to say, oh yeah, no, listen, I feel like I have level so-and-so influence with Don, and we would be able to go over here and say that Savannah has level 4 influence. All of a sudden you begin to hear this common language around leadership, and what it's done is shift their beliefs, driving a different behavior, not only internally, but externally.
But it begins with language. I love that. So I'm going to give you a last formula, and it's one I had a chance to share with your team a couple of months ago. And it's actually not one from a podcast, but it's one I developed for a keynote that I do about the 10 elements of a well-told story, how to be a better storyteller. The real key to being a good storyteller is often asking better questions. I, years ago, created this little formula where I really believe that if we do good research about the people that we get a chance to interact with, the more we know about who we're going to be standing in front of, the more high school yearbook photos I could pull of you.
Yeah.
And the more I know about you, the better the conversation is going to be. No question. More research leads to better connection. Through that connection, we find common ground. That's the thing that really leads to a great question. Common ground that we share, which we would only know if I'd done the right research. And now I'm no longer the question asker here asking you, Mr. Superstar over here, or you, the buyer of my product. Suddenly we're eye to eye because I've connected to you. And now I'm able to break through and ask better questions. I'm able to ask questions that might otherwise almost come off as offensive in some ways. In a particular interview I did with Michael Jordan, after the interview was done, Jordan actually shared a story that he had never shared before in hundreds of thousands of interviews he'd ever done. Pretty crazy, but it was because we worked through the circles to get through the breakthrough. Create research, make a connection, and then get to the breakthrough. Chris, I cannot thank you enough for taking time out of your busy day to sit here, talk leadership, which I know is your favorite topic, but to talk it with us and to actually offer up some of the wisdom you've gained over the many years working with John and with the Maxwell team. Chris, I am so grateful that today you were a corporate competitor with us.
Thanks for having me. As I mentioned, I'm an avid listener of this podcast. One of the things that John said to us as we began talking and dreaming about what it would look like to have your team join with us was, John said, hey, you got to figure out how they do that podcast, because they do a phenomenal job on the podcast. And so I'm honored to be here. Thank you. More importantly, I love your heart, Don. Everyone deserves to be led well. And whether or not you are talking about being a great teammate or driving great team principles, what we like to call you our chief storyteller, whatever it might be for you, at the heart, at the root of all of that, all the formulas you have, it's because you have a heart for people and that they deserve to be led well. It is an honor to be on here and to partner with you and what we're doing together with organizations around the world underneath Maxwell leadership. I am excited for the future of formulas that we're going to be able to create and pass along to team members.
Wow. Is there any more fun than having someone with as much wisdom as Chris Goede to jump in and help us bring the year to a close? I love the idea and the way Savannah played through it to bring us these formulas and the opportunity to think about what was some of the best we learned over the year, and maybe a reminder to you how you can use it. But there were a couple of really good lines that Chris had, so I want to call him out for that too. I love the concept of leadership being a visual sport, that we have to model it, that for those who work with us to believe and give us the credibility that we need as a great leader, it is about being a great model. I also loved the very simple definition he had about culture. I've developed several definitions over time to try to make sure I can explain culture, but culture equals how we think, act, and interact. Wow, that's pretty simple, but it is within our organization. How do we think? How do we act? How do we interact? What's acceptable? And that says so much about us. And then finally, I loved his common language leads to common beliefs, which leads to common behaviors. Language, beliefs, behaviors. But it starts with speaking very clearly, very distinctly, what it is you stand for. That's what leadership is all about. Thanks so much for another year together, another year of learning, and I can't wait for next year. Now, if you want in any way for myself or our team to spend time with your team or discuss ways that we can help develop your leaders or enhance your company culture, please visit maxwellleadership.com/Don Yeager. If you could share one habit, one thing you've done consistently that allowed you to separate yourself from your competitors, what would it be? In my 30-year career, 2,500 of the greatest athletes, coaches, and leaders answered that question for me.
This is Don Yeager, who did that that article I was telling you about.
Don, Dave Sims with Coach K. How you doing?
Hey, Don. How you doing, my man? Great, sir. How are
What they gave to me is what I'm giving to you in my online course, Journey to Greatness. Through engaging storytelling and on-demand videos, you will learn the 16 habits that will jumpstart your personal growth. I will instruct you on how to apply these winning characteristics to your life through custom workbook exercises. We are slashing the price for our podcast listeners. Lifetime access to Journey to Greatness is normally $399, but for our podcast listeners, it will be $49 with the code podcast at checkout. Click the banner on corporatecompetitorpodcast.com to enroll. Thanks for listening to the show. I would be so grateful if you left us a rating and a review. We will be rolling out a new episode every Wednesday. To be the first to listen, subscribe to the podcast on our website, corporatecompetitorpodcast.com. Plus, as a thank you gift, you will receive a free chapter from one of my best-selling books on the habits of high-performing teams. Stay in touch by connecting with me on social media at Don Yeager, Yaeger, on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Until next week. I appreciate you.